Today is part 2 of our series, An Unexpected Christmas. And as you know, in the Bible, the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are 4 very similar but not identical accounts of Jesus. Matthew and Luke are the only books that mention the birth of Jesus. Luke begins his story with the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist, followed by the story of the angel telling Mary that she will give birth to a son and that she is to name him Jesus. But Matthew doesn't begin his story with a. He begins with the genealogy of Jesus. Before ever telling of the birth of Jesus, Matthew gives us a list of the ancestors beginning with Abraham. And this is really an unusual way. He wants his audience to know that not only was Jesus a descendant of Abraham, the father of the Jews, Jesus is also related to King David. All right, we'll try this again. So Jesus is related to Abraham. He's the son of Abraham. He's the son of David. And that's very important because every Jew understood that the promised Messiah would not only be a descendant of Abraham, but also a descendant of King David. So Matthew begins his story with the genealogy of Jesus, but as we discovered last week, he goes off script a few times. Matthew breaks from tradition, and he mentions 4 women in the lineage of Jesus. And 3 of the 4 aren't even Jewish. Matthew also goes out of his way to include and even highlight some people in the family of Jesus that most of us would not have included. Matthew unnecessarily highlights people we would rather him just skip over. Because anyone familiar with Jewish history would read it and would want to know why. Matthew, why did you do that? Because if you're trying to convince people that Jesus is from God, then you should probably leave out all the ungodly people in the family of God. But by including and even highlighting the not so perfect people in the story, Matthew is letting us know something very important. He's letting us know that imperfect people are not just part of the story of Jesus, they are the point of the story. And that's good news because Matthew understood this. Matthew understood this better than anyone else because their story was his story. He was a tax collector and a sinner. Matthew was one of those imperfect people that Jesus had personally invited into the bigger story of God. So on that day, on the day that Jesus invited Matthew to follow him, Matthew invited Jesus to his house for dinner. And the self-righteous religious leaders who had been watching Jesus' every move, they personally had nothing to do with people, sinners, like Matthew. And so they took issue with Jesus accepting Matthew's dinner invitation. They took issue with that. And they asked Jesus' disciples this question: why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why? See, self-righteous people are very big into guilt by association. Guilt by association. And that's not how Jesus lived his life. Not at all. And these self-righteous experts, unaware of their own sin, take issue with Jesus spending time with sinners. Do you see the irony of that? But see, that's the way Jesus lived. Jesus always went out of his way to spend time with people, religious people tried to avoid. So when Jesus overhears the question, Jesus answers their question. He said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." Which doesn't offend Matthew and his friends because they know they're sinners. People far from God know they're far from God. They really do. But what Jesus says next really goes to the heart of the matter. It goes to the heart of why Jesus came to earth in the first place. It goes to the very reason that God sent Jesus to the earth in the first place. Matthew chapter 9, verse 13, Jesus says, "But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus came for people who recognize their sin, not for self-righteous people who don't see their need for change. Jesus came for sinners. And again, that wasn't offensive to Matthew and his friends because they knew they were sinners. It was the self-righteous religious leaders who were also sinners, but their careful observance of their made-up religious rules kind of blinded them to the fact that they were just as sinful and in need of a Savior just as much as Matthew and his tax-collecting friends. And so years later, as Matthew is writing his gospel and he's considering his own story, and he's realizing that the story that he's about to tell, the story of Jesus, it has to include the very people Jesus came to save, sinners. So it wasn't a mistake on Matthew's part to include them in the story. It was the point of the story. And the point of the story is this: Jesus came to save sinners. Sinners like you and sinners like me. But see, up until this time in history, in Judaism, up until this time in history, almost everyone believed that your standing with God was based on what you have done or not done. So almost everyone believed that their standing with God was based on their own personal righteousness. And even today, many Christians still operate that way. They still believe that. But see, Jesus, he changed it. He flipped the switch. He flipped the script. And the good news of the gospel is this: that our standing with God is not based on what we do for God, but on what God has done for us. See, because no one is righteous. No one is righteous. No one is good enough. And no one can do enough to be right with a holy and perfect God. I've tried it. It can't be done. And that's the point. And Matthew understood this because he understood that if his own righteousness was his only way to God, his only path to God, then he knew he couldn't make the cut. He didn't have a chance. But now Matthew realized that Jesus was introducing something that was brand new, a brand new way of thinking. And Matthew understood that Jesus' teaching, it was very different than anything that had ever been said before, anything that he ever understood. And now he understood that everyone, everywhere, now has access to God. Not based on what they have or have not done, but based on what God has done for them through Jesus Christ. That's good news. And this was a completely different approach to God. So the idea that Jesus, the Messiah, came to save people not just because of the good they've done, but in spite of the bad that they had done. Because that idea, that truth, was so radical. It was so radical and different than anything that anyone had ever heard before. Matthew knew that he had to make sure that his audience knew that Jesus was related to sinners. Because the whole point of the story is Jesus came to save sinners. So Matthew goes out of his way to make sure his audience knows that Jesus was related to sinners. And not just any sinners. I mean, not just any sinners, but sinners who could win awards for their sin. So this is how Matthew begins his account of the life of Jesus. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. All right, we get it. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But then there's Judah and his brothers. Judah and his brothers. Let's talk for a minute about Judah. We don't know a lot about Judah, but this is what we know. Judah had 11 brothers, and together they're the 12 sons of Jacob. They're the 12 sons of Jacob, and we know that God would eventually change Jacob's name to Israel. And so the 12 sons of Jacob eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. Of all the sons of Jacob, isn't it interesting that God would choose for Jesus to be a descendant of Judah? Most of us would have picked Judah's more famous and more righteous brother, Joseph. If you grew up going to Sunday school, you know the story of Joseph. You know the story of the coat of many colors. You know about the jealousy of his brothers, and you know about his integrity, and you know about his character. But you know what? Joseph was not the son through whom Jesus, the Messiah, would come. It was Judah. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. Jesus is the Lion of Judah, not Joseph. Now, God didn't choose the oldest. The oldest son was Reuben. He didn't choose Reuben. And God didn't choose the best and the most righteous, Joseph. He chose Judah. Reuben and Joseph, they aren't even mentioned in the list. It's just Judah and his brothers. It's Judah. And Judah is not who any of us would have picked, which is exactly why Matthew included him in the genealogy of Jesus. The story of Judah actually begins in Genesis chapter 37. And you know a lot of this. Judah and his brothers, they're very jealous of Jesus. They're jealous of Joseph's favored status with their dad. And then one day their dad sends young Joseph out. He's probably a teenager at this time. He sends Joseph out to the fields to check on his older brothers. And in Genesis 37 we read that when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe which he was wearing, and they took him and they threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat their meal. So they rip this, beautiful colored robe, technicolor robe off, and they throw him into this empty well. And then they just sit down and eat lunch. And while they're eating lunch, they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with Joseph. And this is what happens. The brothers looked up, and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. And their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So here comes a caravan of traders loaded with all this stuff that they're going to take to Egypt to sell. And that's when we're introduced to Judah. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to the Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood," and his brothers agreed. Again, Judah wasn't the oldest, but apparently he was the leader. He was the brother with the most influence. And Judah is able to convince his brothers that it would be better to sell the brother as a slave and make a little money than to just kill him. This is Judah, one of the ancestors of Jesus. The man who said, "Let's not kill him, let's profit from his pain." That's Judah. So that's what they do. They sell their brother as a slave, and from Judah's perspective, that's probably the last time that he'll ever see or hear from his brother again. And then the brothers take that fancy coat of Joseph's and they dip it in animal blood and they bring it to their father. And it's just so cruel. They lead their father to believe that Joseph has been killed by a wild animal. I mean, how cruel is that? And all the brothers agree to this. And they all agree to take this truth of what really happened. They're determined to go to their grave with that truth, with that lie. But in his heart, Judah has to know that he's the one that's ultimately responsible. He was responsible for Joseph because he was the leader. He could have changed Joseph's life, but he chose not to. So with Joseph out of the way, Judah decides to go on with his life. And then Genesis chapter 38, we learn that Judah is a shepherd in the same town as his brothers. Well, Judah gets married, and he has a bunch of kids. His first 3 children are boys. And the oldest son marries a woman named Tamar. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what, but the Bible does tell us that this husband, Tamar's husband, this oldest son of Judah, was so wicked that the Lord put him to death. This is where it gets a little strange. At this time in history, and in this culture, and in this situation, the expectation was that the next oldest brother, if he wasn't already married, that he would marry his brother's widow, Tamar in this case, and give her and her deceased brother a family and the financial security and protection that comes from having a family. That's just the way it was. But the second son of Judah was also wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. In all of this, Judah, the father-in-law of Tamar, is the one who is ultimately responsible for providing for and taking care of Tamar. It is his responsibility as the father-in-law. But Judah's third son, he's too young to marry, and so Tamar has to wait until he grows up to marry him. Well, by the time that Judah's youngest son is grown, Judah has forgotten about Tamar. He's forgotten about the one he's responsible for. And the expectation for Tamar is that she must continue to live as a widow out of respect for that family. And in that culture and in that time, Tamar had no other option. She didn't. Tamar would have not been able to work or provide for herself, and she would not be allowed to remarry. So the one person who had the responsibility to provide for her and take care of her, has completely forgotten about her. That's Judah. So Tamar is desperate. This is where it really gets weird. Tamar is desperate, and she decides to take off her widow's clothes and disguise herself as a temple prostitute. And one day, Judah, her father-in-law, sees Tamar sitting there. He doesn't recognize her. So Judah decides to hire this prostitute, not knowing that she was his daughter-in-law. And Judah agrees to a price, and he agrees to send what he owes the very next day. Send what he owes to her the very next day. But Tamar asks Judah for his signature ring and his staff as a pledge or guarantee that she would get paid, and he agrees. So the very next day, when Judah sends one of his friends to the gate where he saw her with payment, she's not there. Well, eventually, Judah forgets about it and goes on with his life. But 3 months later, Judah is told that Tamar, the daughter-in-law that he had ignored and not protected or provided for, was pregnant. And that's when Judah gets all self-righteous. He gets all self-righteous, and he demands that Tamar be put to death for her unfaithfulness. She has shamed the family. Let me ask you this. Have you ever known anyone like that? Have you ever known anyone who was so self-righteous and judgmental of other people's sins, everyone else's sin, only to find out later that they had some dark secret? I mean, have you ever met someone who, have you ever known someone that they've just hammered and hammered and hammered away on an issue, only to find out later that they actually struggled with that same issue? If you're an unbroken person, before God, if you have a secret, if you're hiding something, if you're ashamed of something that nobody else knows about, did you know that sometimes that secret manifests itself in a sense of self-righteous condemnation? When Judah demands that Tamar be put to death for her sin, Tamar sends a message. She sends a message to Judah by way of his servant saying, the father of the baby is the owner of this ring and this staff. And that's when Judah realizes that in spite of all his self-righteous indignation, Tamar is actually more righteous than he is. Some of the most self-righteous people that I've ever met are some of the people that I trust the least. Because in the back of my mind, behind all of that anger and righteous indignation, I'm thinking to myself, you've got a secret, don't you? There's something you're not telling us. In his self-righteous anger, Judah says, Tamar has shamed the family. She must be burned alive. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Judah. Is this the same guy who sold his brother into slavery and then lied about it to his parents and is living with that lie? Is this the same guy? And I'm thinking, wait a minute, isn't this the same guy who broke his parents' heart and has carried this secret around for more than 20 years? Is this the same guy? Isn't this the same guy who promised to take care of his daughter-in-law but broke his promise and now has just left her living in poverty and forced to live a life of shame? Is this the same guy? And now he wants to talk about her sin while ignoring his sin? I mean, isn't this the guy who raised two boys that were so evil that the Lord put them to death? Isn't this the same guy? And now he wants to put Tamar to death for a sin that he was a part of. That's what self-righteousness does. That's what it does. And if you allow, it allows you to see other people's sin as different than your sin. And self-righteousness, it causes you to exaggerate their sin and minimize your own sin. Well, 6 months later, Tamar gives birth to a little boy, and his name is Perez. And he is in the genealogy of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I'm thinking, Matthew, you should have just skipped over that story. I mean, that's the kind of story that messes up the whole story. But the story of Judah and Tamar didn't mess up the story, because that is the point of the entire story. Jesus came for sinners. And I'm a sinner, and you're a sinner. This isn't the end of Judah's story, and you know this because years later, there's a famine in the land. And you remember, and so Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy grain, and guess who's in charge of the grain? Joseph. So 20 years later, 20 years earlier, Joseph was a slave in Egypt, and now 20 years later, he's second in command. He's the prime minister of all of Egypt. It's an incredible story. Well, the last time that Judah and his brothers had seen Joseph, he was a teenager, and so now he's 30-something years old, and they don't recognize him. They don't recognize him. They don't know it's Joseph. They don't recognize him because, he's dressing like an Egyptian. He's walking like an Egyptian. They don't recognize him. I had to throw that in. That was just too easy. I had to throw that in. Sorry. They don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. This is one of the most dramatic events, maybe in all of literature, because Joseph recognizes them, and, for a while there, he messes with them. I don't blame him. He messes with them a little bit, and then I can imagine, taking off that big Egyptian headdress thing and looking at him and saying, "I'm Joseph, your brother." And that's if that was a movie, the sounds that would be playing, the dramatic tone. That is amazing that they thought he was dead, and now they're standing before him asking for his help, the one that they sold into slavery. But Joseph forgives them. Isn't that Joseph forgives them, and he tells them that what they did, they meant for evil, but God used it for good. What an amazing story. Joseph didn't give Judah and his other brothers what they deserved. He gave them what they needed, forgiveness. Joseph, and that's really the point of the story. And the point of the story for you and me is that through Jesus, God has given us what we need and not what we deserve. It's the same thing. What we deserve is punishment. What we deserve is death. But what he gave us, what we need, is forgiveness and grace and mercy through Jesus Christ. So that's the story of Judah. It's the story of someone who deserved one thing, but was given something else that he was completely undeserved. And what Joseph did for his brothers is a beautiful picture of what God has done for us through Jesus Christ. God's grace and forgiveness is undeserved, but it's available to everyone, regardless of what they have or have not done. Your hope and your salvation, and my hope and my salvation, really has nothing to do with what you are able to do for God. It has everything to do with what God has done for you through Jesus Christ. And as Matthew sets out to write this story of Jesus, before he even gets to the birth of Jesus, before he says anything else, Matthew reminds us through the genealogy of Jesus what has always been true, that God throughout history has chosen broken, messed up people with a past, people with secrets, and he's invited them into a bigger and greater story of God. Judah's story is your story. Judah's story is my story. And it's the story of Christmas because Jesus came to save sinners. So today, regardless of your past, regardless of your guilt and your shame, regardless of your secrets, regardless of what you've done or failed to do, please know that God doesn't want your sin to separate you from him any longer. He doesn't want that. That's why he sent his son into the world, to save sinners, to remove the barrier between us and God. No one has access to the Father through his or her own goodness. That's not how it's done. Access to God is undeserved grace and forgiveness that has always been through Jesus Christ. When you come clean about your sin, when you come clean about your sin and your sinful desires, not only will God forgive you, but he will also give you the grace you need to deal with your past and forgive yourself. This is the story that we've all been invited into by God. And it's a story that is still being written today. And it all begins by acknowledging that Jesus Christ is, in fact, who he claimed to be. He is the Son of the living God. And it all begins by acknowledging that, by putting your faith and your trust in him, trusting what he's done for you, putting your trust and your faith in that, and by identifying your life with him through baptism. That's where it begins. And when you do that, not only will you be forgiven of your sin, but you will also be given the grace to deal with your past and forgive yourself. Your standing with God is not based on what you do for God, but it's based on what God has done for you through Jesus Christ. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's the good news. That's good news. So why not accept that gift? Why not accept that gift? And why not give your life to Jesus? He gave his life for you. There's no better time to start following Jesus than right now. There's no better time to give your life to Jesus than right now. And if you're ready to make that commitment this morning, we would love to celebrate that decision with you this morning. Following Jesus is the greatest decision you could ever make. It's a decision you would never, ever regret. If we can encourage you, if we can help you, if we can pray for you, if you have questions, if you just want to talk to someone, we would be glad to do that as well. The shepherds of this church are going to be available down front and in the back during the singing of the invitation song, and they are here for you. So if there's any way that we can help you, if there's any way that we can encourage you, won't you please let us know as we stand and sing.